I walked into the house after work, expecting the usual routine: reheated leftovers, the low murmur of a sitcom filling the quiet, and maybe some idle conversation with Becca, my wife. Instead, my world shattered the moment I saw my wife. Becca stormed into the living room from the kitchen, unrecognizable, with a bottle in her hand. Her hair was wild, stray strands curling as if caught in a gale. Streaks of smudged mascara carved paths down her cheeks, and her raincoat clung to her shoulder, precariously draped as if thrown on in haste. The sharp scent of alcohol hit me, mingling with her fragmented, slurred ramblings about meeting up with her college friend. I froze, my briefcase slipping to my side like a forgotten burden. Words lodged in my throat, unspoken. She swayed on unsteady feet, her laughter brittle and unnatural, slicing through the room like a misplaced tune. And then it struck me. Becca seemed to have returned shortly before me, as she was still wearing her coat. She let the coat slip off her shoulders, crumpling into a damp heap on the floor. Beneath it, nothing. Not a single thread. The shock crashed into me, a physical force that seized my breath and sent my pulse racing in sharp, jagged bursts. But she didn't seem to notice. Or care. With a disconnected grin, she stumbled over to the couch, collapsing with an awkward sprawl that stripped away the last semblance of dignity. Her phone tumbled from her hand, landing softly on the cushion beside her. I stood there, paralyzed, my mind racing with questions that had no answers. The image before me felt surreal, like a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. This was not just another careless night. Something darker lurked beneath the surface, a shadow I had ignored for too long. The weight in my chest became unbearable. Images of the past weeks flashed in my mind like fragments of a broken mirror. The missed calls, the vague excuses, the time she came home too late and too intoxicated to make sense. I took a step closer, every movement deliberate, as if bracing for a storm. Becca's breathing was shallow and uneven, her chest rising and falling with a rhythm that added to the unease clawing at me. My hand trembled as I pulled out my phone, driven by a compulsion I could not explain. It was not about shaming her. It was about capturing the undeniable proof that things had unraveled far beyond repair. The camera clicked, the sound stark and final in the stillness of the room. Each photo etched this moment into permanence, a document of the collapse I could no longer deny. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint noises from the street beyond the walls. Her phone, lying so close yet untouched, glimmered faintly in the dim light. It beckoned me, its presence an unspoken challenge. I hesitated. I did not touch it. Not yet. The night was far from over, and I could feel it in my core. This was the pivot point. A threshold I was about to cross. Whatever happened next would shape everything that followed, and there was no turning back. I stood there, frozen, my gaze fixed on Becca's unconscious figure stretched out on the couch. Her chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm, a stark contrast to the storm building inside me. Her phone lay beside her, its screen dark and silent, yet its presence felt overwhelming, as though it pulsed with secrets I had long suspected but refused to confront. For months, unease had been clawing at the edges of my mind. Her unexplained absences, the vague excuses, the way she seemed to recoil when I reached out to her. I had told myself it was stress or boredom, tried to rationalize the growing distance between us. But now, as I stared at her, those rationalizations dissolved, leaving only cold certainty. I reached out and let my hand hover above her phone, hesitating. It was not fear that stopped me, but the knowledge that crossing this line would change everything. Whatever I found would be irreversible. The questions tearing at me demanded answers, and deep down, I already knew I was ready to face them. With deliberate calm, I picked up the phone. As soon as the screen lit up, a notification appeared. A message from someone named Daniel said he had an amazing time that evening and could not wait to see her again. The words did not sting, but they froze me in place. There was a profound stillness inside me, a quiet that settled like a shroud. Slowly, I unlocked the phone. Becca had never changed the passcode, and opened her messages. The thread with Daniel was right at the top. I opened it and began to read. Each line cut deeper than the last. He had written that he loved the way she had looked at him and wished they had more time together. Her response had been just as intimate, promising that next time they would not waste time on drinks and would head straight to his place. My jaw tightened as I scrolled further, the details falling into place like pieces of a puzzle I wished I had never started. Their messages spanned weeks, beginning as playful flirtation and escalating into explicit exchanges. The photos I found left no room for doubt. Pictures of the two of them together, some in crowded bars, others taken in private moments that burned into my memory. It was not just physical. Their words carried an intimacy that went beyond infidelity. He was not a one-time mistake. He was the person she turned to, the one she confided in when she should have been talking to me. I scrolled through every message, every photo, each one adding to the mountain of evidence. It felt less like uncovering the truth and more like building a case, one that left no room for uncertainty. One exchange struck me harder than the others. Daniel had written earlier that evening that he hated leaving her like that, and Becca had replied that he was worth it and that she would make it up to him. I set the phone down, my movements careful, deliberate. I looked at her again, sprawled on the couch, oblivious to the destruction she had left in her wake. For months, I had doubted myself, convincing myself that my suspicions were unwarranted, that my insecurities were to blame. But now, the truth was undeniable, laid bare in front of me. My hands were steady. The initial wave of shock had passed, replaced by a cold, quiet resolve. Tonight, everything had come to light. There was no turning back. Whatever came next, I would face it head-on. When Becca finally stirred the next morning, I was already in the kitchen, seated at the table, waiting. Her raincoat hung over the back of a chair, a stark, silent reminder of everything that had transpired the night before. Beside it, her phone rested in the center of the table, next to a steaming cup of coffee that sat untouched. In my pocket, my phone held the photos I had taken. Every detail of the scene was purposeful, orchestrated to strip away any chance of ambiguity. She shuffled into the room, her steps slow and uneven. Her hair was a disheveled mess, and her glassy, unfocused eyes betrayed the lingering haze of the previous night. She stopped abruptly when she saw me, her gaze shifting to the phone on the table. Her confusion quickly morphed into a guarded wariness. She mumbled a hoarse greeting, her voice cracking with the effort. Without preamble, I asked about Daniel. My tone was even, deliberate, and left no room for evasion. She froze mid-step, her expression tightening as though she had been struck. Her response came in the form of a weak attempt to feign ignorance, claiming she did not understand what I meant. I leaned back, my gaze locked on her. I repeated the question, each word sharper than the last. Her lips parted as though to speak, but no sound followed. Her eyes darted to the phone again, and she stammered out a denial, insisting she had no idea what I was accusing her of. Calmly, I reached for the phone and slid it across the table toward her. I laid out the evidence, the messages, the photos, the plans, and the months of deception. Her hand trembled as it hovered above the device but did not pick it up. Her voice, barely above a whisper, offered an excuse that it was not what it seemed. I echoed her words with disbelief, pressing her further. The calm veneer I had maintained began to fracture as I asked her directly if she considered this to be just talking. Becca flinched visibly at my words. She tried once more to minimize her actions, claiming it was nothing serious, but the weakness in her tone betrayed her. I reminded her of the messages I had read, my voice rising slightly as I recounted her betrayals. Each accusation struck with precision, leaving her visibly shaken. Her defenses crumbled, and she sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands as tears began to fall. Her sobs were accompanied by a feeble admission. She had not intended for things to go this far. My response was firm, unyielding as I demanded to know why. Why him? Why any of it? After a long pause, she confessed to feeling invisible, claiming that my focus on work had left her lonely. Her words carried an accusatory tone, suggesting that her actions were a response to my perceived neglect. I repeated her claim incredulously, challenging her reasoning. Was the time I spent supporting us worth less than the attention she craved from him? She bristled defensively, arguing that with Daniel, she had felt free, able to be herself in a way she could not with me. Her explanation struck me like a blow, but I kept my face neutral, refusing to let her words penetrate. I pointed out that instead of speaking to me about her feelings, she had chosen deceit. Her silence was deafening. I laid bare the extent of her betrayal, the lies, the excuses, the way she had dismissed my suspicions and made me feel like I was losing my mind. She tried to defend herself, saying she had not known how to tell me. My voice hardened as I countered that she had found ways to communicate with Daniel easily enough. Her actions spoke louder than any apology she could offer. Her whispered apologies fell flat. I told her plainly that sorry did not erase the lies, the betrayal, or the damage she had done. She reached for me, pleading for a chance to repair things, offering to cut off all contact with him and attend therapy. I pulled away before her hand could touch mine, rejecting her offer. Therapy required honesty, I reminded her, and she had already proven she was incapable of that. Her shoulders slumped as her tears continued to fall. She seemed to deflate entirely as I stood, the sound of my chair scraping against the floor reverberating in the silent room. I told her calmly that I deserved better than this, that I would not fight for a marriage she had already abandoned. Her faint whisper asked what I meant, but the answer was clear. It was over. I informed her of my plans to pack my belongings and leave, adding that she would hear from my lawyer soon. She did not argue. Her silence was the only response as I left the room. As I packed, the weight of the confrontation settled heavily on me. There was no satisfaction in exposing the truth, only an overwhelming sense of loss. By the time I closed the door behind me, the finality of her betrayal was absolute. There was no going back. After Becca left the room, I remained seated at the kitchen table, my eyes fixed on the phone she had abandoned. Its dark, reflective screen revealed a distorted version of my face, a face I barely recognized anymore. Time seemed to stretch infinitely, each minute dragging on as a storm of emotions churned within me. Anger rose first, sharp and fiery, igniting every nerve. It consumed me briefly, its intensity blinding as I thought about how casually she had dismantled the life we had built together. But anger burns quickly, leaving only ashes in its wake. What replaced it was far heavier, a suffocating sadness that settled over me like a weighted blanket. It wasn't just her betrayal that crushed me, though that was devastating in itself. It was everything leading up to this moment. The trust one had given her, the instincts I had ignored to avoid seeming paranoid, the times I had confronted her only to be met with dismissive laughter or accusations of being overprotective. I had chosen to believe her every time, clinging to the idea that we were stronger than my suspicions. Now, those choices felt like knives, stabbing me with the cruel clarity of hindsight. Memories, unbidden and relentless, poured into my mind. I saw her smile the first time we met, the way her laughter had lit up the room. I remembered quiet mornings over coffee, our conversations meandering without direction, and the dreams we had once shared. All of it felt like a cruel lie now. How much of it had been real? Had she ever truly loved me, or had I been nothing more than a placeholder in her life? I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white as I fought to keep the weight of these thoughts from crushing me entirely. Her infidelity wasn't confined to a single act or a single person. It was every choice she had made, the lies, the excuses, the moments she had looked me in the eye and chosen deception over honesty. The phone sat in front of me like a monument to her betrayal. For the first time in hours, I took a deep breath. The shock had subsided, leaving behind a grim clarity. This was beyond repair. Trust wasn't something that could be patched up like a crack in the wall. It was the foundation of everything, and ours had crumbled completely. I couldn't imagine pretending anymore, sharing meals, sleeping beside her, or believing her words when they would forever be tainted by this knowledge. I couldn't imagine trusting her again. I stood and paced the room, my thoughts spiraling. For a fleeting moment, I blamed myself. Had I worked too many late nights? Had I overlooked signs I should have caught sooner? But I quickly realized that no amount of introspection would change the truth. Becca had made her choices. Time and again, she had chosen to betray me instead of addressing her feelings honestly. I paused in front of the window, staring out at the quiet street below. The world outside continued as though nothing had changed, its stillness a jarring contrast to the upheaval inside me. The sound of clicking nails drew my attention. The dog padded into the kitchen, his eyes wide and searching as he looked up at me. I knelt down, running a hand over his head, and murmured an apology. He didn't deserve this. None of us did. The weight of everything pressed down on me again, but this time it brought with it a sense of purpose. Staying here wasn't an option. Staying would mean living in the shadow of her betrayal, questioning every word, every gesture. It would mean sacrificing my self-respect for the sake of a relationship that no longer existed. I returned to the table and picked up a pen and paper. Writing grounded me, gave me a sense of control in the midst of chaos. I began listing what I needed to pack, who I needed to contact, and the steps I would take to untangle our lives. The sadness remained, an ache in my chest that refused to go away. But alongside it grew something else. Determination. This wasn't the end of my life. It was the end of a chapter, a painful, gut-wrenching chapter, but a chapter nonetheless. As the sun began to rise, casting soft light across the kitchen, I felt a strange peace. Not because the pain had disappeared, it hadn't, but because I had made my decision. Becca had chosen her path, and now I was choosing mine. I glanced at her phone one last time, its screen still dark and unresponsive. Then I pushed it away and stood to begin packing. It was time to move forward. By the time the golden rays of the afternoon sun began streaming through the kitchen windows, my mind was made up. There was no hesitation, no room for second-guessing. I walked into the bedroom, retrieved my suitcase from the closet, and unzipped it with a sound that sliced through the oppressive silence of the house. Each item I packed felt like a piece of closure as I mentally outlined the steps ahead. Calling a lawyer, finding a place to stay, and starting the process of severing the tangled ties of our shared life. This wasn't a decision I had ever anticipated making. When I had promised forever, I had meant it. I had believed in us, in the strength of the vows we exchanged. But the trust that had been the foundation of those promises was gone, reduced to rubble by her choices. I wasn't leaving because it was the easy path. I was leaving because staying would destroy the last remnants of my own strength. Before walking out, I returned to the kitchen table, my gaze falling on the phone she had left behind. The confrontation from that morning replayed in my mind with painful clarity. Becca had pleaded for another chance, her words desperate yet hollow. I hadn't followed her when she retreated to the bedroom. There was nothing left to say. Taking out my own phone, I typed a message to a lawyer whose contact information a friend had shared with me during an unrelated discussion months ago. The message was simple and direct. Asterisk, I need to discuss filing for divorce. Can we schedule a meeting this week? Asterisk. When the text was sent, I sat back and exhaled deeply. The weight of what I was about to do pressed heavily on my chest, but alongside it, I felt an unshakable resolve. For far too long, I had silenced my instincts, doubted my worth, and ignored the growing cracks in our relationship. No more. The following days were consumed by logistics. A friend offered me their spare room, and I moved in with only the essentials, a few clothes, my laptop, and the items I couldn't leave behind. The house that had once been my sanctuary became a distant memory, no longer a place of comfort but a site of broken trust. Each task became an exercise in detachment. I canceled joint accounts, redirected my mail, and cut ties wherever necessary. I blocked her on social media, severing the last remaining avenues of connection. It was both liberating and exhausting, like pruning overgrown branches from a dying tree. Nights were the most difficult. In the quiet of unfamiliar surroundings, my mind replayed the highs and lows of our life together. Happy memories turned bitter under the shadow of her betrayal. The laughter we had shared, the plans we had made, all of it felt like it belonged to a different life, one that no longer existed. In those moments, I leaned on my closest friends. They didn't judge me or offer empty platitudes. Instead, they listened, reminding me that I wasn't alone. Their support became a lifeline, helping me navigate the murky waters of heartbreak and uncertainty. As weeks turned into months, I began to rebuild. I found a modest apartment across town, a space that felt like a clean slate. It wasn't much, but it was mine, a place where I could start to heal. I buried myself in work, rediscovered hobbies I had once loved, and began prioritizing my well-being for the first time in years. Reflecting on everything, I came to understand the fragility of trust. It isn't something that can be patched up or forced back together. Love, as powerful as it is, cannot sustain a relationship on its own. It requires honesty, commitment, and mutual respect, all of which Becca had discarded. The experience was painful but profoundly educational. I learned that no matter how deeply you care for someone, you cannot make them choose you. I realized that staying in a toxic situation doesn't prove strength. It erodes your spirit. Most importantly, I discovered that leaving isn't failure. It's an act of self-preservation. Now, as I look ahead, I feel a cautious sense of hope. The pain hasn't vanished, but it has dulled, replaced by the knowledge that I am moving forward. This isn't the end of my story. It's the start of a new chapter. If you've experienced something similar, my advice is simple. Do not settle for someone who chooses deceit over loyalty. Do not let fear of the unknown trap you in a life that drains your soul. Walking away is hard, but sometimes it is the only way to find peace.